In the bitter winter of 1847, workers at the Millbrook Falls Textile Company stumbled upon something hidden beneath a set of loose floorboards in the warehouse. What they found wasn't just old paperwork, it was a time bomb. Tucked away in a dusty bundle were birth certificates, marriage licenses, and other personal records that painted a disturbing portrait of the town's founding family. The Weatherbys, once considered the pillars of Millbrook Falls, were revealed to have spent generations marrying within their own bloodline. This was no accident. It was a deliberate strategy, a calculated effort to keep control of the town's booming textile empire within a single twisted family tree. At the heart of it all was Silas Weatherby, the brooding patriarch who had taken 3 of his own first cousins as wives, one after the other. Each marriage brought children into the world, whose existence was quietly masked by silence and secrecy. What made this secret possible was the cooperation of the very people meant to protect the town doctors, who altered records, clergy who looked the other way, and officials who chose loyalty over justice. For decades, the truth remained buried. That is until those workers pulled back the boards and set history on a collision course with revelation. Silas didn't just run the mills, he ruled them. By the early 1850s, Millbrook Falls had grown from a sleepy village of a few hundred to a bustling textile hub of over 2,000. All of it was thanks to the Weatherby family's relentless drive. The town lay nestled along the Millbrook River, a natural artery that powered the enormous looms and carried shipments from Maine to distant markets like Charleston and Chicago. The mills themselves stretched for half a mile, massive red brick structures that thundered with mechanical life from sunrise to well past dark. The constant roar of machinery became the soundtrack of the town. And at the top of it all stood Silas Weatherby, lean, sharp-featured, and cold-eyed. A man who carried his lineage and ambitions like weapons. People learned to recognize the signs, the hard stare when production lagged, the way his jaw tensed at questions about his family, and the tapping of his long fingers when he was thinking about his next move. Overlooking it all was the Weatherby mansion, perched on the hill like a watchtower of privilege. Built from local granite and surrounded by pristine gardens, it loomed above the working-class streets with an air of untouchable power. Everything about it seemed perfectly respectable until you looked closer. The third-floor windows were always shuttered, though lights sometimes flickered through the cracks at night. Servants moved with an eerie mix of discipline and unease, avoiding questions about what went on upstairs. Visitors noticed, but no one spoke. Even the town's spiritual center, the tall white First Congregational Church, couldn't escape the shadow of the Weatherbys. It stood at the heart of town, its spire rising high. But its sermons seemed more interested in maintaining social order than asking questions about the source of the Weatherby fortune. What began as a discovery under the warehouse floor would in time lead authorities to that mansion on the hill. And behind those shuttered windows, they'd find a truth far darker than anyone had imagined. In Millbrook Falls, power didn't just come from industry, it came from the pulpit too. And no one embodied that link between profit and piety more than Reverend Josiah Holbrook. He was a thin, intense man, with a voice that could rattle pews when he spoke of God's wrath. Holbrook arrived in town the same year Silas Weatherby assumed control of the mills, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. From the start, their partnership was built on mutual advantage. Holbrook's sermons often leaned into themes of divine blessing in business, the sacred duty of family, and the importance of preserving what he called God's chosen line. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. Everyone in town understood who those messages were aimed at the Weatherbys. Millbrook Falls ran on a clear social hierarchy. The Weatherbys ruled from their mansion like nobility separated from the town by manicured lawns and layers of silence. Below them were the town's business class, the supervisors, the store owners, families like the Hutchinsons and the Brewsters, people who owed their livelihood to the mills and made sure to keep their allegiance in the right place. At the base of the pyramid were the workers. They came from everywhere. Irish immigrants escaping famine, French Canadians chasing opportunity, and New Englanders displaced by hard times. They lived in cramped company housing along the river, worked 12-hour shifts surrounded by dangerous machines and thick cotton dust, and endured the ever-present threat of fires that could consume an entire floor in minutes. It was a hard life, but one with a kind of stability. The Weatherby Company paid on time. The homes were modest, but maintained. There was a company doctor, and Silas Weatherby. He walked the factory floors. He knew names. He asked questions. But what struck workers most wasn't his business acumen. It was how interested he was in their families. Who they married, who their children were, who they were related to. This curiosity wasn't limited to the mills. The Weatherby family had their hands in every part of town life. They funded the school, donated books to the library, and provided land for the cemetery. When the railroad finally came to Millbrook Falls in 1852, it was Weatherby money that decided where the station went, conveniently located for the mills. The town's only newspaper, the Millbrook Chronicle, ran on Weatherby advertising, and the editor, Thomas Caldwell, had developed a gift for printing good news, no matter what the mills were up to. But nowhere was the Weatherby influence more tightly woven than in the town's leadership. Silas's uncle Ezra ran the company's finances. His cousin Jeremiah managed mill operations. Another uncle, Caleb, served as the town physician. His cousin Rebecca had married the local magistrate. Every seat of power was filled by someone who shared Silas's last name or his blood. By the end of 1854, this tightly controlled world had become the norm. The people of Millbrook Falls accepted the rhythm of mill life, the moral authority of the church, and the quiet omnipresence of the Weatherby family. Few questioned why Silas Weatherby, wealthy, respected, and nearing his mid-40s, remained unmarried while his peers raised families. Most assumed he simply hadn't found a woman suitable for his position. They were wrong. Silas had found someone, and his choice would send a ripple through the town like a stone dropped into still water. On a crisp October morning, the townspeople filled the pews of the First Congregational Church. Reverend Holbrook, standing tall behind the pulpit, delivered the announcement with the gravity of a funeral. The marriage banns were declared. Silas Weatherby would marry Miss Patient Weatherby, his first cousin, and the daughter of his uncle, Ezra. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the church's tall windows seemed to go still. Patient sat quietly in the Weatherby family pew. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed ahead. At 24, she had the kind of porcelain beauty that made people look twice, pale skin, untouched by labor or sun. Dark hair woven into intricate braids, gray eyes that revealed more melancholy than joy. Her dress was elegant, but restrained a deep blue wool with jet buttons that glinted in the morning light. But it was her expression that stayed with people, something between devotion and dread. As if she knew this marriage wasn't just a personal union, but a message to the entire town. A reminder that in Millbrook Falls, the Weatherby name meant power, and power always kept itself in the family. The whispers began the moment the church doors opened and the congregation spilled into the streets. Neighbors who'd known both Silas and Patient Weatherby since childhood turned to each other in hushed disbelief. "But they're first cousins," murmured Mrs. Elelina Hutchinson to her husband as they passed the rows of tenements near the mill. Her voice was low but urgent, the sort of tone reserved for something scandalous. William Hutchinson, who ran the carding machines and knew all too well how deep the Weatherby family's reach extended, gave her arm a gentle squeeze. "That's not our concern, Elelina," he said firmly. Mr. Weatherby knows what he's doing, and Reverend Holbrook wouldn't have announced it if there was anything wrong about it. Still, the rumors spread fast. They buzzed through the company store and the boarding houses, and most dangerously, they echoed in the mill break rooms, where workers shared coffee and dry bread between shifts. Among the French-Canadian workers, many raised with Catholic beliefs, the reaction was particularly intense. In Quebec, you'd need a bishop's special permission for something like this, muttered Philippe Bouchard, who ran a loom in mill number 2. And even then, it would still be discouraged. The Irish workers, hardened by survival and superstition, focused less on doctrine and more on outcomes. "It's the children you need to worry for," said Bridget Ali, one of the few women who worked the machinery floor instead of the boarding houses. "My gran used to say, when cousins marry God, marks the children weak minds, crooked backs, and worse. It's punishment for sins kept in the blood." These murmurs might have faded into background noise, if not for the arrival of Dr. Marcus Penfield, a young physician from Boston, recently settled in Millbrook Falls. Independent of the Weatherby family, he'd come to open his own practice, bringing with him the latest in medical training from Harvard. When he heard of the upcoming marriage, he asked to meet with Silas directly. The meeting took place in Silas's office at the mill, a sparse space ruled by a heavy oak desk and shelves lined with ledgers. Dr. Penfield had rehearsed what he planned to say, citing medical literature and ethical reasoning. But Silas met his concern with a cool, composed demeanor that left the young doctor rattled. "Doctor," Silas began, his tone patient and patronizing, "I do appreciate your concern, but I fear you're working off flawed assumptions, both moral and medical. Perhaps you've spoken with my Uncle Caleb. He's practiced medicine here for decades. His view differs from yours, I'm sure." Penfield shifted in his seat, trying not to sound defensive. "With all respect, Mr. Weatherby, your uncle's experience doesn't change what the data shows. When cousins marry, the chances of hereditary issues rise. It's a well-documented fact." Silas didn't flinch. "You're assuming things about my family you don't understand," he said evenly. "The Weatherby line has been unusually free of hereditary defects. We've kept records for generations, very thorough ones. I can assure you, patient and I come from healthy, robust stock." Something about the way Silas said it, the clinical precision, the confidence, made Dr. Penfield hesitate. What kind of records? Who had maintained them? But before he could ask, Silas continued. "As for the spiritual side, Reverend Holbrook has consulted scripture. Abraham married his half-sister. Isaac married his cousin. Jacob married 2. These unions were not only accepted, they were blessed by God. Are we to assume modern prejudice is more authoritative than divine precedent?" The argument left Penfield at a loss. He could counter medicine. He could push social concerns. But scripture interpreted through Reverend Holbrook's lens was a shield he couldn't penetrate. Still, he made one final effort. "Even if we set medicine and theology aside, Mr. Weatherby, the town is talking. There could be unrest. People are unsettled." Silas's expression chilled. "Doctor, your business is health. Mine is people. Let's each mind our own. The workers would do better to focus on their jobs than my family. Idle chatter solves nothing. The mills feed this town, not their gossip." Dismissed. Penfield walked back through Millbrook Falls with a mix of frustration and unease. At the company store, he passed clusters of workers speaking in low voices, falling silent when he approached. The town was clearly divided between those too cautious to question the Weatherby dynasty and those who sensed something was terribly wrong. That evening, Penfield made a decision that would ripple through the town's future. He opened a leather-bound journal and began documenting everything: the conversation with Silas, the troubling implications of cousin marriage, and what he suspected was a wider pattern hidden under the town's polished surface. His first entry was dated October 15th, 1854, the same day the engagement was announced. He ended it with a question he couldn't shake. Was this just a single unusual union, or part of something deeper, older, and far more disturbing? 3 weeks later, as the first snow began to dust the hills, Silas and Patient were married in the First Congregational Church. Reverend Holbrook presided. The entire Weatherby family filled the front pews, and the ceremony was carried out with solemn dignity. Patient wore her mother's old wedding gown, carefully altered to fit her delicate frame, and clutched a bouquet of pale chrysanthemums, preserved in the church's cold vestry. From the outside, it was a picture of tradition and grace. But to those who watched closely, the servants, the mill hands, the new doctor with his notebook. It was also a ceremony steeped in silence, secrecy, and the weight of something long buried. What struck nearly everyone in Millbrook Falls that November morning wasn't just the unusual marriage. It was how muted the entire celebration felt. In a town where weddings were typically lively affairs, filled with music, food, and dancing, that carried on late into the evening, the Weatherby wedding stood out for its somber restraint. The reception was held inside the mansion's main parlor, attended only by immediate family and a few carefully selected community leaders. The rest of the town, including the mill workers who had been given the afternoon off, was excluded entirely. While small groups gathered in public squares and boarding houses to quietly observe the occasion, no one outside the Weatherby circle was invited to take part. Dr. Marcus Penfield, observing discreetly from a distance later, wrote in his journal that the bride had appeared pale and emotionally withdrawn during the ceremony. Her voice was barely audible as she recited her vows, while Silas seemed utterly composed, as if finalizing a business deal rather than entering a lifelong union. Even more unsettling was the atmosphere among the extended Weatherby family. Though they fulfilled their duties with outward formality, there was a noticeable tension in the room, a silent weight that suggested this marriage, while not surprising, was unsettling even to those within the family. After a brief reception, the couple departed for a short honeymoon in Portland, leaving behind a town brimming with quiet speculation and growing unease. In the boarding houses and tenements, conversations carried late into the night, the mood heavy with whiskey and suspicion. Around the stove in Mrs. Brewster's boarding house, old Timothy Flanagan leaned forward and said what many had been thinking, but were too afraid to voice. Mark my words. A man like Silas Weatherby doesn't marry for love. There's purpose behind this, and it's not one the rest of us are meant to understand. But whatever it is, it'll come to the surface sooner or later. As it turned out, he was more right than anyone could have imagined. For a time, though, it all seemed fine. The first year of Silas and Patient's marriage unfolded with an ordinary rhythm that reassured some and silenced others. The mills thrived. The town remained stable, and Mrs. Weatherby slowly emerged as a familiar face in Millbrook Falls' social life. She hosted quiet afternoon teas, helped organize charitable efforts through the church, and offered the kind of soft-spoken charm expected of a woman in her position. But for those paying closer attention, something wasn't right. Patient, always slim, grew visibly thinner as the months passed. Her skin, already pale, took on a near-translucent hue, and her movements became deliberate and careful, as if her body required more effort to manage than it once had. On her weekly visits into town, she walked with slow precision, never straying far from the main road, never lingering too long in conversation. Dr. Penfield saw her occasionally during these outings, and each time his concern deepened. One afternoon outside the post office, he gently asked about her health. She responded with practiced politeness, saying, "I'm quite well, thank you, doctor. My Uncle Caleb sees to our family's medical care. He understands our constitution better than anyone." The emphasis on constitution struck Penfield as odd, too practiced, too pointed. Before he could press further, she excused herself and returned to the mansion. That night, Penfield recorded his impressions in his journal. He noted signs consistent with chronic anxiety or a digestive disorder, but also recognized the deeper issue. Patient Weatherby's reluctance to speak openly suggested that discussing personal health outside the family was strictly forbidden. Whatever was affecting her, it was to remain behind closed doors. As the couple's first anniversary approached, the town's attention was diverted by more immediate trouble. A fire broke out in Mill Number 3, damaging the facility and forcing nearly 200 workers into temporary layoffs. Silas moved quickly, redistributing workers across the remaining mills and adjusting schedules to soften the blow. His swift, calculated handling of the crisis only reinforced how thoroughly the town's well-being depended on the Weatherby empire. But even amid that chaos, another thread was beginning to unravel, one that had nothing to do with machinery or production. Late one evening, Dr. Penfield received a knock at his door. It was Mrs. Martha Brewster, the no-nonsense woman who ran the largest boarding house in Millbrook Falls. Usually steady and composed, she now looked unsettled. She sat across from the doctor and lowered her voice. "Doctor," she said carefully, "what I'm about to say can't leave this room. I need your word on that." Penfield nodded, sensing the gravity of what was to come. "I wouldn't be talking about the Weatherbys if I didn't believe something was deeply wrong," she began. "I've been running this house for near 15 years, and I've seen a lot. Workers come and go. Some stay, some disappear. But there's a pattern I'm starting to see. And it's not just about the mills. It's about that family on the hill and what they're hiding." She hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Something's going on inside that mansion, and I think it's been going on for a long time. I've seen all types," Mrs. Brewster said, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if trying to steady her nerves. "In 15 years of running this house, I've housed close to 300 men, hard workers, some rough around the edges, some no trouble at all. But lately, something's changed. I've seen something that doesn't feel right." She paused, glanced at the window, then leaned in. 3 times in the past 6 months, good, reliable boarders of mine have vanished, packed up and left without warning. Dr. Penfield straightened in his chair. "That happens, doesn't it? Mill work is hard. People come and go." "It does," she nodded. But this felt different. All 3 left right after they started asking questions about the Weatherbys. Her voice dropped. Old Pete Kowalski, he worked down in the dye house, was asking why Mr. Silas would marry his cousin when there were plenty of decent girls in town. Jimmy Sullivan from the carding room made jokes about how the Weatherby family tree didn't branch much. Then there was Tom Mitchell, one of the best boarders I ever had. He was planning to bring his wife and children up from Boston. He'd been asking about schools. Someone told him the Weatherby children didn't go to the town school, and that set him wondering what they were hiding. "What happened to him?" Penfield asked. She hesitated, then said, 2 days later, Jeremiah Weatherby called him into the office, told him his job was gone, eliminated, due to improvements in machinery. That very night, Tom left town. No goodbyes, just gone. And he left behind tools, winter coats, books, things no working man would leave unless he had no choice. The doctor scribbled the names down in his journal, troubled more by the pattern than the particulars. As Mrs. Brewster left, he stood silently at the window, watching the Weatherby mansion across the valley. Its lights glowed steadily on the 1st and 2nd floors. The 3rd floor, as always, remained shuttered and dark. The following day brought grim confirmation that something more serious was happening. A statement was issued by Dr. Caleb Weatherby, patients. Weatherby had suffered what he called a nervous collapse and would remain under strict bed rest and supervision. No details were shared, but her absence from public life in recent weeks had already raised eyebrows. Now silence gave way to whispered fear. Then came a second, far more shocking announcement: Silas Weatherby would marry again. This time the bride would be another cousin, Prudence Weatherby, the daughter of Caleb himself. The wedding, it was said, would take place just as soon as patient was well enough to give her blessing and approval. Dr. Caleb claimed she would offer within the month. The town reacted with disbelief. Even those who had begrudgingly accepted the first cousin marriage struggled to process the idea of a second, while the first wife lay sick and unseen inside the mansion. To many, it felt less like a family matter and more like a revelation of something darker, an unraveling of the quiet pact the town had made to ignore the Weatherby family's private ways in exchange for prosperity. Reverend Holbrook tried to steady the storm from the pulpit that Sunday. His sermon, delivered with thunderous zeal, was titled, "The Lord's Mysterious Plans." With eyes flashing and fists clenched against the pulpit, he declared, "It is not our place to question the path God has set for the Weatherby family. His will is not always understood, but it is always righteous." But the words landed with a hollow thud. In the back pews, people exchanged glances that spoke more than any whispers. For the first time in years, the aura of inevitability surrounding the Weatherbys had cracked. Silas's empire, so carefully constructed on wealth, obedience, and silence, was beginning to feel less like a dynasty and more like a house built on rotting timbers. And deep inside that house, behind shuttered windows and guarded rooms, something was stirring. Something the people of Millbrook Falls would soon be unable to ignore. The sermon that Sunday was anything but subtle. Reverend Holbrook stood tall at the pulpit, his voice resonating with a theatrical gravity as he proclaimed that Brother Silas has been called to carry a special burden in this community. According to the minister, it was not only appropriate, but divinely ordained that Silas be joined in marriage to women of his own blood helpmates, who understood the sacred responsibilities of the Weatherby name. Any who questioned these unions, Holbrook warned, revealed their own lack of faith in God's providence. To many, the sermon felt like scripture twisted into justification. But to Dr. Marcus Penfield, sitting quietly near the back, it felt like a mask slipping just enough to glimpse what was underneath. He watched as Holbrook's gaze lingered on Silas in the front pew. There was an unspoken understanding between the two men, a shared acknowledgement that the sermon's message wasn't for the congregation, it was for control. Penfield could no longer sit idle. After the service, he approached Silas directly as the textile magnate made his way to his carriage. Mr. Weatherby, the doctor, said, choosing his words carefully, "I understand that your wife is under your uncle's care, but I wonder if a second opinion might be worthwhile. I have some experience with nervous disorders," and Silas stopped and turned to face him. His expression was polite, but devoid of warmth. "Dr. Penfield," he said, his voice smooth but final, "my wife's health is a private family matter. It will be treated within the family as is appropriate. A woman in her condition requires care from someone who understands the particular sensitivities of our bloodline." The phrase struck Penfield with a cold certainty. This wasn't just about illness. It was about control. Before the doctor could press further, Silas stepped into his carriage and was gone. That night, Dr. Penfield poured his unease into his journal. "I no longer believe the Weatherbys marry within their family simply to preserve wealth. There is something else, something they are managing. A hereditary trait, perhaps, that an outside physician might detect. I now fear Patience Weatherby's illness may not be a side effect of her marriage, but a reason for it. She may have been chosen precisely because of how she would decline." 2 weeks later, news spread through town. Patience Weatherby was dead. The official statement claimed she had died peacefully in her sleep under the care of Dr. Caleb Weatherby and her closest family. A quiet funeral was held 3 days later, closed to the public. Only relatives and a few key townspeople were permitted to attend. Silas, dressed in black, stood solemnly at the graveside, his expression carefully composed. But those who knew grief recognized something off his mourning felt more like performance than pain. And then came the final blow. Just a day and a half after Patience was buried, Silas Weatherby married again. His new wife, Prudence Weatherby, was also his cousin, the daughter of his uncle Caleb. The ceremony was so secretive that most townspeople only learned of it after it had already happened. If the first cousin marriage had raised eyebrows, this second coming with indecent speed on the heels of his first wife's death shattered what little faith the community had left in the family's moral facade. Conversations that once unfolded behind closed doors were now being spoken aloud. If Silas could remarry another cousin so quickly, so coldly, then what else might the family be capable of? How many of their secrets were kept behind the walls of that mansion, protected by wealth, faith, and fear? The union with Prudence marked the beginning of what the townspeople would later call the dark years of Millbrook Falls. At the time, the changes were slow, almost imperceptible, like mist creeping in from the coast. But they were real. Prudence, unlike the fragile and withdrawn Patience, had a sharper edge. At 26, she was slightly older, with auburn hair, striking green eyes, and a vivacity that set her apart from her predecessor. Yet underneath that vibrancy was a jittery intensity. She spoke quickly, moved constantly, and seemed always on edge, like someone holding back a scream. Dr. Penfield, by now deeply suspicious of the Weatherby household, turned his attention to the broader community. He began documenting what he observed in the mills, in the boarding houses, in the behavior of workers and their families. What he uncovered was a chilling pattern of coercion and control. Mill employees dismissed suddenly after questioning family matters. Community leaders subtly pressured to align with Weatherby interests, and a growing sense among townspeople that speaking out came at a cost. Over the next 2 years, Penfield would fill nearly 50 pages of his journal. What had begun as medical curiosity had grown into a careful chronicle of something darker, a closed dynasty manipulating an entire town under the guise of religious purity and industrial benevolence. And at the center of it all stood Silas Weatherby, calculating, composed, and, as Penfield now feared, capable of far more than anyone dared imagine. The first thing Dr. Penfield noticed wasn't something someone said, it was what people had stopped saying altogether. In the weeks following Silas Weatherby's second cousin marriage, public conversation about the family faded to near silence. People were still curious, perhaps more than ever, but the questions once asked freely at church socials, in the company store, or over dinner in boarding houses simply stopped. That silence, Penfield realized, wasn't natural. It was fear. And once he began looking, the patterns emerged quickly. Workers who had once spoken too loudly about the Weatherby family suddenly found themselves reassigned to dangerous machines. The kind that demanded constant attention and carried the constant threat of injury. Others noticed that their time-off requests were regularly denied. Births, funerals, family visits. It didn't matter. In contrast, those who kept their heads down and avoided certain topics saw their schedules become more flexible. Some even received raises, but the most effective tool of control wasn't scheduling. It was housing. Nearly 2/3 of the town's workers lived in company-provided housing. Cooperative families began receiving subtle rewards: fresh paint on their homes, new furniture, even lowered rent. Their children were accepted into the highly competitive company school. Meanwhile, those deemed problematic faced sudden inspections and citations for obscure infractions. Leaky pipes became violations. Family visits were deemed overcrowding. A single missed rent payment brought eviction threats, and the pressure reached beyond mill workers. Mrs. Brewster, the same boarding house operator who had first voiced concerns to Dr. Penfield, found herself in a precarious position when her license came up for renewal. Town clerk Samuel Weatherby, another cousin in the ever-expanding Weatherby network, informed her that new regulations required all boarding house operators to submit detailed tenant reports. These reports were to include not just behavior, but conversations especially, anything deemed disruptive to community harmony. As Clerk Weatherby put it with bureaucratic calm, boarding houses are key to preserving order. We expect them to promote hard work, personal responsibility, and respect for authority, the values that keep Millbrook Falls prosperous. The message was clear: spy or shut down. That evening, Mrs. Brewster came once more to Dr. Penfield's office. Her face was weary, but her eyes held their old resolve. "Doctor, I can't keep sharing what I hear. I have a granddaughter. I won't risk her future. But I also can't pretend everything's fine." She reached into her handbag and handed him a small, worn leather notebook. "I've been writing things down. What I've seen, what I've heard. You're not dependent on them like I am. You should have this." That night, Penfield read every page. What he found chilled him. Dozens of entries, each a small incident on its own. But together they painted a picture of a town held under invisible siege. Workers punished for idle jokes. Families denied housing upgrades. A mother who wondered aloud why Prudence looked so strained at church saw her husband assigned to a high-risk dye machine. He lost 2 fingers within the week. A man who kept a tally of the Weatherby marriages had his teenage son fired from the company store for theft, an accusation later proven false, but never officially reversed. Most disturbing were Mrs. Brewster's notes on the Weatherby children, or rather the complete absence of them. Both Patience and Prudence had shown signs of pregnancy. But there were no birth announcements, no children seen in public with their parents, no toddlers running through the mansion garden, no infants brought to church. The mansion had no nursery staff, no nannies, no signs of family life. Where are the children, she had written in one entry. In 2 years with Patience, and now 8 months with Prudence, surely there would be evidence of at least one child. But there is nothing. Then came the observation that tied it all together: the 3rd floor of the mansion. Always shuttered. Lights visible at odd hours. Servants under strict contracts that barred them from discussing their work. "What are they hiding up there?" she wrote in her final entry. As Penfield finished the notebook, he looked up at the mansion on the hill. The 1st and 2nd floors glowed with evening light. The 3rd remained cloaked in darkness, and then movement. Just for a second, behind one of the shuttered windows, a flicker of light shifted briefly, illuminating a shadow. Someone was up there, watching, moving. The next morning, news swept through the town. Prudence Weatherby had collapsed in the garden. According to the family, she had been tending to her roses when she suddenly fell unconscious. The gardener had carried her inside. Dr. Caleb Weatherby was once again her sole physician. The diagnosis, unsurprisingly, was nervous exhaustion, the same mysterious affliction that had plagued her cousin Patience before her. Penfield knew better. This wasn't coincidence. This was pattern. And he no longer believed the Weatherby family was simply eccentric or overly private. What he saw now was a dynasty maintaining control not just through wealth and religion, but through fierce silence and secrets. Secrets locked behind the 3rd floor shutters of a mansion that had come to symbolize something far darker than success. Something that had its roots not just in family, but in blood. The town of Millbrook Falls, already numb from years of quiet unease, was stunned into silence once more when the Weatherby family issued yet another marriage announcement. Within hours of Prudence Weatherby's collapse, while she remained unconscious inside the mansion, news broke that Silas Weatherby had formally requested permission from the town council to marry his 3rd cousin, Charity Weatherby, the daughter of his late Uncle Nathaniel. Even for a community that had come to accept the Weatherbys' unusual preference for keeping marriages within the family, this sudden declaration bordered on the obscene. The haste alone sent a clear message: the rules that governed everyone else simply did not apply to the Weatherbys. To Dr. Marcus Penfield, the implications were undeniable. This wasn't about love. It wasn't about consolidating wealth. He now saw it as a system intentional, calculated, and sinister. The Weatherbys were curating their own bloodline with an almost scientific precision, and those who came too close to uncovering the truth were being silenced through pressure, exile, or something far worse. And as he documented the latest development in his journal that night, Penfield made a fateful decision. He would investigate the mansion's third floor, no matter the cost. He began carefully under the guise of his daily house calls through the residential streets near the Weatherby estate. What he noticed confirmed what his gut had long suspected. The mansion, while stately and serene by day, changed after sunset. During the daylight hours, the household ran with perfect, almost militaristic order. Groundskeepers trimmed hedges, servants carried out chores, deliveries came and went. But after dark, a new pattern emerged. Always the same 3 women, never part of the daytime staff, would slip through a side door just after dusk. They climbed the servant staircase, heading straight to the 3rd floor. They carried basins, towels, and bottles that bore the unmistakable silhouette of medicine flasks. These were not housemaids tending bedrooms. These were caregivers attending patients, or something far more secret. From his vantage point behind the carriage house, Penfield often waited long past midnight. On more than one occasion, he heard what confirmed his worst fears, crying, not the hushed sobs of grieving adults or restless servants, but the drawn-out, helpless crying of children. Weak, exhausted, ongoing. It chilled him in a way no medical textbook ever had. Then came the breakthrough. Mary Catherine O'Brien, a recent arrival from Ireland, had taken temporary work in the mansion during Prudence's illness. Just 18, she had the quick mind and bold nature of someone who hadn't yet learned the town's unspoken rule. You don't talk about the Weatherbys. After Sunday service, once the crowd had drifted away, she approached Dr. Penfield, her voice low and urgent. "You're the only person in this town who isn't tied to them, doctor. And I need to talk to someone. I've seen what's on the 3rd floor." That evening, in the safety of Penfield's office, Mary Catherine told him everything. Her hands trembled. Her voice broke. But what she described confirmed not only Penfield's suspicions, it revealed a horror he had not dared imagine. The 3rd floor, she explained, wasn't closed off or abandoned. It was inhabited. 6 rooms lined a narrow corridor, each with locks on the outside. In each room was a child. But not just any child. These were the hidden descendants of the Weatherby line, the biological cost of generations of cousin marriage. "There's a boy," she said, her voice catching. "Maybe 12. He can't talk. He has to be hand-fed because he can't hold a spoon steady. His limbs shake when he tries to move. Another girl, no more than 8, rocked back and forth constantly. She makes noises like an animal," Mary Catherine whispered. "Especially when she's scared, which is most of the time." Then came the infants. Some of those babies, their heads are too big, or their arms bend the wrong way. One of them doesn't blink. He just stares. Mary Catherine broke down. Dr. Penfield sat frozen, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. Every part of her testimony aligned with what medical science was only beginning to understand about heredity and the dangers of close blood unions. The Weatherby family's insular breeding was producing profound genetic deformities, and instead of seeking help or admitting failure, they had built a prison for their own children. These were not simply victims of biology. They were being hidden, denied names, and sealed behind locked doors so the illusion of perfection could be maintained. The public saw no children from the Weatherby marriages because the Weatherbys had quietly decided which children were worth being seen. And no one outside the family was ever supposed to know. But Dr. Penfield knew now. And with Mary Catherine's account, he finally had proof. The only question left was how far the Weatherbys would go to keep that proof buried. "Who takes care of the children?" he asked, though deep down he already knew. "Same 3 women as always, Mrs. Abernathy, Mrs. Caldwell, and Mrs. Hutchinson. They're up there every night, and they've all signed papers that forbid them from talking. But I overheard Mrs. Abernathy telling one of the others they've been doing this for over 20 years. That stopped Dr. Penfield cold. This wasn't some recent twisted turn. It had roots going back decades long before Silas ever started marrying his cousins. What struck him hardest was that this wasn't an isolated moral failure. It was a tradition, a carefully maintained family practice. Silas wasn't just following in someone's footsteps. He was continuing a legacy built on silence and suffering. His father, maybe even his grandfather, had likely done the same. Creating a lineage so corrupted by inbreeding that marrying outside the family could risk revealing the damage through children too sick or too visibly flawed to hide. "Mary Catherine," he said carefully, "have you seen anything records logs that might say how many children are up there? How long they've been kept?" She nodded with a tight expression. "Mrs. Abernathy keeps a log feeding schedules, meds, and something she calls incidents, when the kids get violent or need to be restrained." I looked at it for just a moment, but the entries go back 15 years. Some kids are marked as dead with dates. Others, the notes just stop. No reason. No end. A chill settled over him. This wasn't just about sick children hidden from the world. This was evidence of something far worse, neglect abuse, maybe even murder. The ones they couldn't control, or who grew too sick to hide anymore, were quietly erased, their deaths noted in a servant's book, with the same cold efficiency used to record breakfast. Just when he thought the horrors of Millbrook Falls couldn't go any deeper, they did. If this is sending chills down your spine, share this story with someone who lives for dark secrets. Hit the like button to keep us going, and make sure you're subscribed, because it only gets darker from here. Mary Catherine wasn't finished. Silas goes up every night at 9, walks room to room, looks them over like livestock. Doesn't say a word, just writes in a separate leather journal. He locks it in his study. "Doctor." When he looks at them, there's nothing in his face. No emotion, no sorrow. Like he's watching a science experiment. What she described wasn't neglect. It was a clinical, deliberate system of cruelty. Silas wasn't just hiding the results of inbreeding. He was studying them, documenting the effects, noting outcomes like the children were test subjects in a twisted generations-long experiment. "What about his wives?" Penfield asked. "Did Patience or Prudence know?" Mary Catherine hesitated, then said, "That's the worst part. They knew. Patience would cry for hours after going up there. Prudence got worse as her pregnancy went on. The night she collapsed in the garden, I heard her scream at Silas that she wouldn't let her baby end up like the others. She was trying to run, but she didn't make it to the gate. Now it all made sense why the wives died, why their illnesses were always so conveniently timed. They were picked not just for bloodline compatibility, but for how easily they could be manipulated. Women who'd carry a child and then disappear when they became inconvenient or started to resist. Dr. Penfield stood on the edge of a life-defining decision. He had stumbled upon a buried truth: crimes that included imprisonment, abuse, and the quiet elimination of the unwanted. But he was just one man. The Weatherbys owned everything: the mill, the town council, the church pulpit, and the legal system in 1850s Maine. It didn't exist to protect people like Mary Catherine or an outsider like him. It existed to protect men like Silas, especially when they cloaked their monstrosities in religion and respectability. Dr. Penfield knew that keeping quiet would make him just as guilty as the ones committing these atrocities. Every hour he hesitated meant more pain for those children locked away on the 3rd floor. And the longer he waited, the greater the chance that Silas would cover his tracks, eliminating witnesses, destroying records, making sure no one could ever prove what had happened. As he walked Mary Catherine to the door of his office, he made a choice that would endanger everything. His career, his freedom, maybe even his life, but might also be the only way to bring the Weatherby family's secrets into the light. "Mary Catherine," he said, "I need you to keep working at the mansion. But from now on, be very careful. Don't say or do anything that could make anyone suspicious. Don't try to gather more information. Just act normal. I'll find a way to bring this to the authorities, but it'll take planning." She nodded, but what she said next hit him like a punch. "Doctor," she whispered, "we don't have much time. Mrs. Abernathy said Mr. Silas is planning changes after his marriage to Miss Charity. She said something about cleaning house and making sure there are no loose ends for the next generation." Dr. Penfield's heart sank. This wasn't just another twisted wedding in the Weatherby family's cycle of inbreeding. It was the final phase. Silas was preparing to erase the evidence. Children who had been hidden away like ghosts were now at risk of being murdered, their existence scrubbed clean before the next chapter of the family's legacy began. After Mary Catherine vanished into the night, Dr. Penfield returned to his desk and began writing what he feared might be his last journal entry. If they caught him before he could act, he wanted someone someday to know the truth. His plan was risky, maybe suicidal. It relied on perfect timing, Mary Catherine's help, and a rare combination of luck and courage. He needed access to the mansion's 3rd floor while everyone was distracted by the wedding. There he'd gather physical proof, photos, written records, anything that would hold up under scrutiny, and find a way to get it into the hands of state authorities before Silas could silence him forever. The wedding was set for December 15th, 1856, exactly 2 years and a month after Silas married Patience. Prudence had died just 3 weeks earlier. Her cause of death, according to Dr. Caleb Weatherby, was constitutional weakness and nervous exhaustion. But Penfield now knew better. Mary Catherine had described her collapse as the final unraveling of a woman who simply couldn't survive the psychological torment she was forced to live under. Charity, the intended bride, was a different kind of challenge. At 31, she was older than the other wives and still unmarried, something that stirred gossip even among the family. She was sharp independent and had played a major role in managing the Weatherby business. Unlike her predecessors, she might not bend so easily to Silas's control. That could be why Silas was moving fast before Charity had the chance to ask questions or dig too deep. Dr. Penfield's only shot at the 3rd floor would come under the cover of a medical emergency, one he would engineer with Mary Catherine's help. On the night of December 14th, as family and local leaders gathered for the pre-wedding celebration, Mary Catherine would slip a mild emetic into the punch bowl. The resulting wave of sickness would give Dr. Penfield the perfect excuse to be in the house and access the upper floor without raising suspicion. Once inside, he would take photographs with a newly purchased glass plate camera from Portland and collect anything else that could prove the children's condition and the abuse they endured. Mary Catherine would act as a lookout, using subtle signals to warn him if anyone was coming. The plan came together exactly as they'd hoped. Disguised as a server, Mary Catherine laced the punch with just enough of the compound to induce vomiting without risking long-term harm. Within an hour, chaos unfolded. 8 people were doubled over, retching violently, including the town clerk and even Reverend Holbrook. Caleb Weatherby, old and drunk, was in no shape to manage a health crisis of that scale. With his wedding about to become a public embarrassment, Silas reluctantly allowed Dr. Penfield to step in and treat the sick. Penfield moved from guest to guest, administering remedies that looked more impressive than they were buying time for what he really came to do. Then Mary Catherine appeared beside him, face pale, voice low. "One of the children is having a seizure," she said. "It's bad. We need you upstairs now." "Doctor," Mary Catherine said loudly enough for Silas to hear from across the room, "Mrs. Abernathy says there's a child upstairs having some kind of fit. She's asking if you could take a look since Dr. Caleb's not well enough to respond." Silas froze. His face drained of color, and for a brief moment his eyes darted toward the stairs, as if weighing whether he could reach the third floor in time to stop Penfield from seeing what was hidden there. But with half the town's most respected citizens now watching closely, he couldn't stop the charade. "Of course," he said, his voice tight with strain. "Dr. Penfield, please do whatever is necessary. Mrs. O'Brien will show you the way." But it was Mary Catherine who led him, and the climb felt less like walking up a staircase and more like descending into a nightmare. With every step up the narrow servant stairs, the faint cries he had once dismissed as wind or imagination now grew into a chorus of suffering children crying, some making guttural, inhuman sounds of deep cognitive disability, others sobbing in painful awareness of the hell they lived in. At the top, the hallway revealed the true horror, 6 doors all bolted from the outside, each with a narrow window for observation. The air reeked of old urine medicine and unwashed bodies. Mrs. Abernathy stood waiting, composed, but cold, hardened by years of managing this silent ward of the damned. "Room 4, doctor," she said. "It's the boy again. These spells have been getting worse." Penfield stepped to the indicated door and looked inside. The child, likely around 14 but severely developmentally delayed, was in the throes of a grand male seizure. His thin body convulsed on a mattress already stained from previous episodes, the corners of the room showing marks from where he had clearly injured himself before. But what shook Penfield more than the seizure was what lay beyond that single room. Across the hall, a girl no older than 10 sat rocking back and forth, thudding her head into the wall with mechanical rhythm. Her scalp was scarred from repeated self-harm, and her eyes were empty, disconnected from reality. 2 doors down, in room 3, were twin infants no older than a year and a half, barely able to sit up. Their skulls were grossly enlarged, their arms, twisted eyes drifting in separate directions, their tiny bodies bearing the unmistakable signs of severe genetic damage. Documentation was no longer the priority. The suffering demanded his full attention. He moved quickly from room to room, using his medical training to do what little he could for the children. In the midst of it, he carefully took photographs, using the small glass plate camera hidden in his bag, knowing that what he was capturing could mean the difference between justice and cover-up. The final confirmation of what he feared most came when Mary Catherine guided him to a locked cabinet she had quietly learned to open. Inside were Dr. Caleb Weatherby's medical journals, meticulously kept and dated. The pages held a clinical history of deformity and abuse records of children born with congenital defects, developmental delays, and early deaths. More damning still were the detailed accounts of planned marriages among close relatives. Silas's father marrying his cousin uncles, pairing off with nieces, a systematic breeding program cloaked in respectability. The language was detached, scientific, and horrifying. Early entries referred to mild constitutional frailties, but later pages documented the deliberate continuation of bloodlines already compromised. It was a breeding experiment disguised as family tradition, and its results, the children locked behind those doors, were the evidence. And now finally, that evidence was in Dr. Penfield's hands. Each marriage had been arranged like a breeding contract, carefully planned to concentrate favorable traits while minimizing the more dangerous ones. But what shocked Dr. Penfield the most were the clinical notes in Dr. Caleb's journal pages that treated human beings like livestock. There were entries tracking which unions produced the most manageable offspring and which resulted in deformities or violent behavior. Some combinations were marked as failed attempts. Others were followed by chilling suggestions for future pairings that might yield better results. These weren't the records of a physician. They were the calculations of a man conducting a multi-generational experiment, one where failure meant confinement or quiet elimination. And the most recent entries made the purpose behind Silas's successive marriages sickeningly clear. Each cousin wife had been selected for precise traits that, when combined with Silas's own lineage, would hopefully produce children just impaired enough to justify hiding them. Children who could be locked away without drawing suspicion, but not so impaired that they died too quickly. As Penfield finished photographing the most damning pages, Mary Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face tight with panic. "Doctor," she whispered, "Mr. Silas is coming." Mrs. Abernathy tried to delay him. "Said you were still with the boy, but he wouldn't listen." "He's almost here. You have maybe 2 minutes." Penfield's heart pounded. He had lost track of time buried in the documents, and now Silas was coming almost certainly aware that his secrets were being exposed. If he caught them here, there'd be no confrontation, no argument, just silence, permanent and absolute. They'd vanish like the others. In that moment, Penfield made a choice. He wouldn't hide. He wouldn't sneak back down the stairs and hope the photographs would be enough. He would face Silas directly and force the man to answer for what he had done, gambling that the people downstairs and the evidence now secured in his bag might be enough to keep him alive. When Silas stepped into the corridor, his expression gave everything away. The usual cold composure was gone. In its place was barely controlled rage. He knew. And yet, with the poise of a man who'd spent his life deflecting scrutiny, Silas kept his voice measured. "Dr. Penfield," he said, "I think you may have misunderstood the nature of the situation here. These children are under specialized family care for inherited conditions. Our family physicians understand their needs best." Penfield didn't flinch. He stood in the hallway with the camera tucked into his medical bag and pages of the Weatherby family's crimes captured in photographs. "Mr. Weatherby," he said, his voice steady, "what I've seen tonight has nothing to do with care and everything to do with imprisonment abuse and a systematic attempt to control genetics without the slightest regard for the children born from it. You've sacrificed your own blood in the name of some twisted idea of purity." The words cut through the corridor like a blade. Silas's face tightened. The facade cracked. But instead of reacting with violence, he adopted a different strategy, one just as dangerous. His tone softened, calculated. "Doctor," he said, "I think you're looking at this from the wrong angle. These children, what kind of life would they have out there? Mocked, institutionalized, abused. Here they are cared for. They are protected. They receive better attention than the state could ever offer." Penfield saw it clearly now. Silas didn't just excuse what he'd done, he believed in it. He had rationalized every locked door, every scar, every scream as an act of mercy. In his mind, this wasn't cruelty. It was stewardship. And let's not pretend this would serve anyone. Silas continued. "You expose this, and you'll bring scandal to every family in this town. The mills will suffer. Jobs will vanish. Do you really want to destroy a community for the sake of a few children who frankly would never have had a future?" It was monstrous logic, evil disguised as pragmatism. Silas had built a world where protecting the town's economy justified anything, even hiding the tortured remains of his own bloodline. Penfield didn't respond immediately. He didn't have to. The truth hung between them, too heavy to ignore. But before either man could speak again, Mary Catherine's voice came from the top of the stairs, low and urgent. Mr. Jeremiah and 2 others are coming. I think they mean to trap you up here. Penfield's stomach dropped. The net was closing. Silas hadn't come alone. He had backup, loyal family members who knew exactly what was at stake and were ready to act without asking questions. Penfield understood instantly they wouldn't try to reason with him. They'd make him disappear, just like the others. Dr. Penfield knew he wouldn't get another chance. His only hope now was escape, and more importantly, ensuring that the truth wouldn't die with him. In a desperate move that required both nerve and speed, he handed his medical bag to Mary Catherine, his voice low and urgent. Hide this in the servants' quarters. If I'm not back within 24 hours, take it to the state capitol. Go straight to the Attorney General's office. Tell them what's happening. Tell them children are dying while men argue over politics. Mary Catherine clutched the bag, nodded once, and vanished into the shadows. Moments later, Silas stepped fully into the hallway, and the final confrontation began. Realizing that Penfield had gathered enough evidence to destroy him and the family dynasty they had built, Silas dropped all pretense and resorted to naked threat. "You're alone here, Doctor," he said calmly. "You're surrounded by people who've kept this secret for 20 years. Your word means nothing. Your life depends entirely on how quietly you leave this house and forget what you've seen." But Penfield didn't answer. Instead, he shoved past Silas and headed straight for the stairs, gambling that even the Weatherbys wouldn't risk killing a respected physician with half the town just 1 floor below. Jeremiah Weatherby and 2 others moved to block his path, but the rising hum of voices from the reception made them hesitate. Any noise, any sudden move might bring guests upstairs. And so, reluctantly, they stepped aside. Dr. Penfield didn't look back. He walked out of the mansion into the cold night, fully aware that his life was now measured in days. He spent that night writing a detailed report of everything he had witnessed, organizing the photographs, copying the worst of the journal entries, and preparing sealed packets to send to officials if he was silenced before reaching them himself. He also wrote letters to trusted medical colleagues in Boston and Portland, describing what he'd seen and warning of the long-term consequences of inbreeding masked as tradition. 3 days later, on December 18th, 1856, Dr. Jonathan Penfield was found dead in the Millbrook River. The official story was simple: a tragic accident. He'd been making a house call during a snowstorm, slipped on the icy river rocks, and drowned. The investigation was brief, closed within a week. But Mary Catherine O'Brien knew the truth. She had seen the shadows tailing the doctor from his office that final night. She'd heard the struggle near the bridge. And more than anything, she still had the bag. 2 weeks after the funeral, dressed in plain clothes and carrying all that remained of Penfield's legacy, she made the treacherous journey to Augusta. Her story was met at first with doubt, a servant girl accusing one of Maine's most powerful families. But then, the Attorney General opened the medical bag. The photographs, the notes, the detailed journal entries in Dr. Caleb's own hand. What began as skepticism turned to silent horror. On February 14th, 1857, the Weatherby mansion was raided by state authorities, accompanied by doctors from the state hospital and members of the newly formed Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. What they found went even beyond Penfield's reports. The 3rd floor had not 6 but 8 rooms. 2 had been emptied, hastily scrubbed clean in the days after Penfield's death. But the remaining 6 held children, some no older than infants, others barely clinging to adolescence suffering from starvation disease and psychological collapse. Their eyes were vacant, their bodies broken, their lives erased, hidden away behind bolted doors under the guise of mercy and tradition. It was the beginning of the end for the Weatherby family and the beginning of a reckoning that would haunt Millbrook Falls for generations. The state physicians who examined the rescued children confirmed the worst. Every single one showed signs of severe genetic disorders consistent with multiple generations of inbreeding. Several bore the scars of long-term neglect and, in some cases, outright abuse. But the most damning discovery was Dr. Caleb Weatherby's complete medical records, a meticulously kept archive that not only detailed the family's decades-long breeding experiment, but also revealed the quiet elimination of children deemed too damaged or difficult to control. The journal documented at least a dozen deaths over a 20-year span, officially blamed on illness or fragility. But the evidence showed otherwise. These were deaths by starvation exposure, or, in some cases, deliberate euthanasia. Silas Weatherby was arrested, along with his uncle Caleb, his cousin Jeremiah, and 3 servants who had actively participated in the children's confinement and care. Charity Weatherby, newly married and pregnant, was initially considered a bystander. But under oath, Mary Catherine and others revealed she had known exactly what was happening on the 3rd floor, and had married Silas because she supported the family's genetic goals. What followed became one of the most shocking trials in Maine's history, with headlines reaching as far as Boston and New York. The prosecution presented photographs taken by Dr. Penfield, detailed testimony from Mary Catherine, and the handwritten journals that documented a legacy of controlled reproduction and discarded offspring. The defense argued the family had done its best to care for disabled children who would have suffered worse in state custody. But the photos told a different story of filth, starvation, restraint, and despair. The jury saw through the lies. Silas was convicted of conspiracy, kidnapping, and accessory to murder. He was sentenced to life at the Maine State Prison, where he died in 1863, still insisting that his actions had protected the town from scandal. Dr. Caleb Weatherby, whose clinical notes laid bare the true horror, was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death, though he died in custody before it could be carried out. The Weatherby mills, once the economic heart of Millbrook Falls, were sold to pay for legal costs and the long overdue care of the surviving children. The town never recovered. As the scandal spread, workers fled, businesses closed, and the once thriving mill community became a near ghost town. The mansion, already abandoned, was eventually torn down. Locals swore that even before its destruction, no one could sleep near it. Too many claimed they still heard children crying from the 3rd floor. Mary Catherine O'Brien, whose bravery had brought the truth to light, was quietly relocated to Boston with help from Dr. Penfield's colleagues. She lived out her life in peace, raised a family of her own, but never again spoke publicly about what she saw in that house. The surviving Weatherby children were placed in care, but most didn't live long. Only one, a boy with milder symptoms, was adopted in Portland and reportedly lived a relatively normal life. Yet even his descendants would later carry medical questions that traced back to that dark bloodline. The Weatherby case became a landmark in both legal and medical history. It influenced child protection laws and raised national awareness of the dangers of cousin marriage. Dr. Penfield's notes, along with Mary Catherine's testimony, were used in medical schools for decades as case studies in heredity, ethics, and the consequences of unchecked power. This story reminds us that when power is allowed to fester in isolation, guarded by silence and cloaked in respectability, it can produce horrors hidden in plain sight. Only when someone dares to speak, to act, to risk everything, does the truth have a chance to survive. So what do you think really happened in that house? Was everything truly uncovered, or did Silas take deeper secrets to his grave? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story chilled you to the bone, subscribe for more forgotten horrors and true crime mysteries. Hit that bell so you never miss a tale. Thanks for watching, and remember, the past has a way of reaching forward when no one's looking.